The whisper reached Alina Wren before she even stepped into the ballroom, and it hit her like a slap she never saw coming. She heard her own name pass between two women near the entrance, followed by a laugh that was sharp and cruel. She stopped walking. Her hand tightened around her fan. Something was wrong, and she could feel it crawling up her spine before she understood what it was. "Did you hear what they are saying about Miss Wren?" one of the women murmured, not bothering to lower her voice enough. "They say she was seen alone with a man in the garden at Lord Ashworth's estate, completely alone, no chaperone in sight." "Ruined then," the other replied, almost gleeful. "What a shame, such a pretty face wasted." Alina's chest tightened. She had not been alone with any man in any garden. She had not done anything to deserve this. Yet here it was, already spreading through the room like smoke under a door, filling every corner before she could even find the source of the fire. She forced herself to keep walking, chin lifted, though her knees felt unsteady beneath the weight of her silk gown. The ballroom of Lord Grayson's townhouse glittered with candlelight and crystal, filled with London's finest families dressed in their best, laughing, dancing, watching. And now, it seemed, all of them were watching her. Heads turned as she passed, not the polite, admiring glances she was used to, but something colder. Whispers followed her like a second shadow. A young woman she barely knew turned her back the moment their eyes met. An older gentleman, who had complimented her dancing only a fortnight ago, now looked at her, as though she were something distasteful tracked in on the bottom of a shoe. Alina had done nothing wrong. She knew this with complete certainty. And yet certainty meant nothing in a room where a rumor could travel faster than truth ever could. She found her friend Charlotte near the refreshment table, and the look on Charlotte's face told her everything before a single word was spoken. "You've heard it too," Alina said quietly. Charlotte's eyes were full of sympathy, but also fear, the kind of fear that came from watching a friend's world begin to crumble and knowing there was little to be done. "Alina, it's spreading fast. Faster than anything I've ever seen. Someone wants this story told, and told loudly." "But it isn't true," Alina said, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. "I was never alone with anyone in any garden. I left Lord Ashworth's dinner early because I had a headache. My maid can confirm it. My mother can confirm it." "I believe you," Charlotte said, "but belief will not save you tonight, not against this many tongues." Alina looked around the ballroom again, and this time she noticed something she had missed before. Near the far wall, half hidden behind a group of gossiping matrons, stood Lady Cordelia Vane. She was smiling. Not the warm, easy smile she offered to admirers, but a small, satisfied curl of the lips, the kind of smile a person wears when a plan is unfolding exactly as intended. Alina had never trusted Cordelia, not since the two of them had both caught the attention of the same gentleman the previous season, a gentleman Cordelia had wanted for herself and had not gotten. Since then, there had always been something sharp beneath Cordelia's politeness, something waiting. "It's her," Alina whispered. "Cordelia started this." Charlotte followed her gaze and her expression darkened. "I would not put it past her, but Alina, even if you're right, you cannot accuse her tonight, not without proof. It would only make things worse. They would say you're desperate, throwing blame to save yourself." Alina's hands were shaking now, and she pressed them together to hide it. She had come to this ball expecting an ordinary evening of dancing and polite conversation. Instead, she found herself standing in the center of a storm she had not created, watching her reputation, the only thing truly her own in a world that gave women so little, dissolve in front of dozens of strangers. A group of young men near the card tables glanced her way, and one of them said something to the others that made them laugh. Alina did not need to hear the words to understand their meaning. She felt her face grow hot with humiliation, and for a terrible moment she thought she might cry right there in the middle of the ballroom, in front of everyone who was already so eager to see her fall. She would not give them that satisfaction. "I need air," she said to Charlotte, and before her friend could stop her, she turned and made her way toward the terrace doors, weaving through the crowd as quickly as her composure would allow. Every step felt heavier than the last, every glance from a passing guest another small wound. Outside, the night air was cool and sharp, a welcome relief from the suffocating heat of the ballroom and the suffocating weight of 100 judging eyes. Elena gripped the stone railing of the terrace and took a slow breath, willing her heart to steady itself. Below, the garden stretched out in careful rows of hedges and lantern light, peaceful and untouched by the cruelty happening just behind her. She did not hear the footsteps until they were close. "Miss Wren." She turned, startled, and found herself looking into the calm, steady eyes of Sebastian Ashford, the Duke of Havenwood. She had known him for years, though never well. He was a quiet man, respected across London for his honesty and his refusal to involve himself in the petty games so many of his peers seemed to enjoy. He had always struck her as somewhat distant, somewhat unreachable, a man who observed more than he participated. Tonight, though, there was something different in his expression. Concern, perhaps, or something closer to anger, carefully controlled. "Your Grace," Elena said, straightening quickly and wiping any trace of distress from her face, though she doubted she had succeeded. "I did not mean to intrude on the terrace. I was only—" "You needed air," he said simply. "I understand, the ballroom tonight is not a kind place." Elena's throat tightened. "You've heard it then, the rumor." "I have heard several versions of it," Sebastian said, "each one worse than the last. By the time I left the card room, they were saying you had run off with a soldier and returned in secret, ashamed." Elena let out a small, disbelieving laugh, though there was no humor in it. "It grows more absurd with every telling. Soon they will say I vanished into thin air and reappeared with wings." "It is not amusing," Sebastian said, his voice low. "Forgive me, but it angers me to see this happen to you. I have known you since we were children, Miss Wren. I have never known you to behave dishonorably, not once." Something in his words steadied her, even as her eyes stung with unshed tears. "Thank you for saying so, but I fear my character will not be enough to stop this. Not tonight, not when so many people seem eager to believe the worst." Sebastian was quiet for a moment, studying her with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time all evening, as though someone in that entire glittering room actually saw her, rather than simply the story being told about her. "Do you know who started it?" he asked. Elena hesitated, then decided there was little reason to hide it from him. "I believe it was Lady Cordelia. I have no proof. Only instinct, and the memory of the way she smiled at me just now, as though she had been waiting for this moment for a very long time." Sebastian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That would not surprise me." From inside, the music shifted, and a fresh wave of laughter drifted out through the open terrace doors, laughter that felt, to Elena's raw nerves, entirely too close and entirely too cruel. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the summer night. "I should return to my mother," she said. "She will be looking for me, and I do not wish to give anyone further reason to talk." "Miss Wren," Sebastian said, and something in his tone made her pause. "Whatever happens tonight, whatever they choose to believe, I want you to know that I do not believe it. Not for a moment." Elena met his gaze, and for the first time that evening she felt something other than fear or humiliation settle in her chest. Gratitude, quiet and warm, and something else she could not quite name. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said softly. "That means more than you know." She turned to go, gathering the last of her composure around her like a cloak, bracing herself to walk back into the ballroom full of whispers and watching eyes. She did not know, as she crossed the threshold back into the light and noise, that the Duke of Havenwood remained on the terrace a moment longer, watching her go, his mind already turning over the shape of a decision that would change everything. Behind her, the rumor continued to spread, carried from mouth to mouth like a flame passed from candle to candle, each retelling brighter and more damaging than the last. By the time Elena reached her mother's side near the far end of the ballroom, she could see it in the older woman's face too, the barely concealed worry beneath her polite smile, the quick, nervous glances toward the other guests. "Elena," her mother whispered, taking her arm. "We should not have come tonight." "Running now would only confirm what they already believe," Elena said, though her voice wavered. We must stay. We must hold our heads high no matter what they say." But even as she spoke the brave words, Alina felt the truth settling over her like a shadow she could not shake. A reputation, once damaged, was rarely repaired through dignity alone. She had seen it happen to other young women before her, women who had done nothing more than exist in the wrong place at the wrong moment, only to watch their entire futures collapse beneath the weight of a story someone else had chosen to tell. She did not know, standing there in the candlelight with her mother's trembling hand on her arm, that across the room, Sebastian Ashford had returned from the terrace and was watching her with an expression of quiet, unshakable resolve. She did not know that he had already decided, in the space of a few private moments, that he would not stand by and let this cruelty go unanswered. She only knew that the night was far from over, and that whatever came next, she would need every ounce of courage she possessed to survive it. Sebastian Ashford did not return to the card room after Alina left the terrace. Instead, he stood at the edge of the ballroom, half in shadow, watching the way the crowd moved around her like water avoiding a stone. He had seen cruelty before in his years moving through London society, but rarely had he seen it move so fast, or with such obvious pleasure behind it. He watched Lady Cordelia Vane drift from one cluster of guests to another, her fan moving lazily, her voice pitched just low enough to seem discreet while carrying just far enough to be heard. He could not make out every word, but he did not need to. He recognized the rhythm of a story being told for the second, third, fourth time that evening, each retelling polished a little smoother, a little more convincing. He thought of Alina as a child, running through the gardens at his family's country estate during the long summers when their families had visited one another more freely. She had been fearless then, climbing trees her brother refused to climb, laughing loudly in a way that other little girls were taught to suppress. She had grown into a woman who still carried that same honesty, that same refusal to pretend to be something she was not. It was, he thought, one of the things he had always quietly admired about her, even in the years when their lives had drifted apart and their conversations had become nothing more than polite greetings at events like this one. To see her now, standing pale and shaken beside her mother while an entire room devoured her reputation for entertainment, stirred something in him he had not expected. Anger, yes, but also a clear, cold sense of purpose. He was Sebastian Ashford, Duke of Havenwood. His family's name carried weight in every drawing room in London. He had never before considered using that weight so directly, so publicly, on behalf of another person. He had always preferred to observe from a careful distance, to avoid entangling himself in the dramas that so often consumed his peers. But tonight, watching Alina Wren try to hold herself together beneath the weight of a lie, he found that careful distance suddenly felt like cowardice. He crossed the room slowly, nodding to acquaintances as he passed, giving no outward sign of the decision forming inside him. He needed to think clearly. A rumor like this could not simply be denied. Denial only fed suspicion, made people wonder what exactly was being hidden. He had watched enough scandals unfold to understand that logic and evidence rarely mattered once gossip took hold. What mattered was a new story, one so undeniable, so publicly witnessed, that it would overpower the old one entirely. He found Lord Grayson near the musicians, deep in conversation with two other gentlemen about horses. Ashworth, Sebastian said, using the old, familiar name their circle had always used for their host, though it was technically incorrect, since it was Lord Grayson's estate they stood in tonight, not Ashworth's. He caught himself. "Forgive me, Grayson, a word if you have a moment." Lord Grayson excused himself from his companions with an easy smile. "Havenwood, of course, you look troubled." "I am troubled," Sebastian admitted. "This business with Miss Wren, have you heard the rumor?" Grayson's expression sobered. "I have, ugly business. I do not believe a word of it myself, but you know how these things go once they begin. There is no stopping a story people want to believe." "There may be one way," Sebastian said quietly. Grayson raised an eyebrow, curious now. "And what way is that?" But Sebastian did not answer immediately. His eyes had drifted back across the room, to where Alina stood near her mother, her spine straight despite everything, her chin lifted in a display of dignity that only made his chest ache more. He watched a young matron whisper something behind her fan to a companion, both women glancing toward Eleanor with expressions of mock pity that were really nothing more than cruelty dressed in polite clothing. "I need to think on it further," Sebastian said finally. "But I believe I may have found a solution. Tell me, Grayson, will Lady Cordelia Vane be remaining for the rest of the evening?" "I believe so. Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," Sebastian said, though there was a particular reason, one he was not yet ready to share. He excused himself and made his way toward the refreshment table, where he found a glass of wine he did not intend to drink, using it as an excuse to stand and observe a while longer. His mind worked through the problem the way it worked through matters of estate business or difficult negotiations with tenants, weighing options, considering consequences, searching for the single action that would resolve the greatest number of difficulties at once. A denial from him would help, certainly. His word carried weight. But a denial alone would only quiet the rumor for a night, perhaps two, before it resurfaced in some new form, some new whisper claiming that the Duke of Havenwood had simply been deceived, or was protecting Miss Wren out of some misplaced sense of chivalry. He needed something undeniable, something that could not be reinterpreted or reshaped by clever tongues, something the entire room would witness with their own eyes, leaving no room for doubt or debate. The idea, when it finally settled into full shape in his mind, startled even him with its boldness. He turned it over carefully, examining it from every angle, searching for flaws. It was reckless. It would certainly draw attention, perhaps even more attention than the rumor itself. It would tie his name to Eleanor's in a way that could not easily be undone, not without creating an entirely new scandal. But it would work. He was almost certain of it. No one in London would dare call a woman ruined if the Duke of Havenwood himself had just demonstrated, in front of the entire assembled company, a clear and public regard for her. It would not simply deny the rumor. It would replace it with an entirely different story, one far more interesting to the gossiping tongues of the ton than a cruel and baseless accusation. He glanced toward Eleanor once more. She had moved slightly away from her mother now, standing near one of the tall windows, her arms wrapped loosely around herself as though trying to hold herself together through sheer will alone. She looked so alone in that crowded room, surrounded by people who had, only days before, smiled at her warmly, complimented her gown, requested dances. Now they treated her like something contagious, something to be avoided. Sebastian set down his untouched glass of wine. He was aware, as he began to cross the room toward her, that what he was about to do would change things irreversibly. There would be no quiet retreat from this decision, no explaining it away later as a simple misunderstanding. Once done, it could not be undone. His reputation, carefully built over years of measured, honorable behavior, would suddenly be entangled with hers in the eyes of all of London. He found that he did not care. Eleanor did not notice him approaching at first. She was staring out the window at the dark garden beyond, her expression distant, lost in whatever thoughts were carrying her far away from the humiliation of the ballroom. When she finally turned and saw him standing close beside her, something flickered across her face, surprise mixed with a wary sort of hope, as though she wanted to believe he had come to offer more comfort but did not dare expect it. "Your Grace," she said softly, "is something wrong?" "Miss Wren," Sebastian said, and his voice, though quiet, carried a steadiness that seemed to draw the attention of the nearby guests, the way a sudden stillness often does in a room full of noise. "I find I cannot stand by any longer and watch this happen to you." "There is little to be done," Eleanor said, though her eyes searched his face as though hoping he might prove her wrong. "The story has already spread too far." "Then perhaps," Sebastian said, "it is time for a new story." Before Eleanor could ask what he meant, before the words could even fully form in her mind, Sebastian closed the small distance between them, and in full view of dozens of London's most influential families, gently pressed his lips to hers. The ballroom, which had been humming with music and conversation only a moment before, fell into a silence so sudden and complete that the musicians themselves faltered, their bows stilling mid-note. Every eye in the room turned toward the tall window where the Duke of Havenwood stood, and where a leaner wren, frozen with shock, had not yet found the will to pull away. It lasted only a few seconds, brief and soft, nothing scandalous in its nature beyond the sheer fact of its occurrence in such a public setting. But those few seconds were enough. Enough to rewrite, in an instant, the story that had been consuming the room only moments before. Enough to turn 100 whispering tongues from cruelty to astonishment, from mockery to something closer to fascination. Sebastian stepped back, his expression calm despite the storm he had just unleashed, and offered Elinor a slight, formal bow, as though he had simply asked her for a dance. "Forgive my boldness," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear clearly. "I have long admired Miss Wren, and I find I can no longer stay silent while cruel and baseless rumors are spread about a woman I hold in the highest regard." Elinor stood frozen, her cheeks burning, her mind spinning too fast to grasp what had just happened. Around them, the silence broke into a fresh wave of whispers, but these whispers carried a different weight entirely, curious rather than condemning, astonished rather than cruel. Lady Cordelia, standing near the musicians, had gone pale, her earlier satisfied smile replaced by something far more brittle. Her plan, so carefully constructed, so gleefully executed, had been undone in a single unexpected moment by a man she had never anticipated stepping into the story at all. Elinor's mother pressed a hand to her chest, torn between shock and something that looked almost like relief. Charlotte, standing nearby, wore an expression of pure astonishment, her mouth slightly open, unable to find words for what she had just witnessed. And Elinor herself, trembling, overwhelmed, humiliated in an entirely new way, and yet strangely, undeniably grateful, could only look up at Sebastian Ashford and wonder what on earth she was supposed to say next. The Duke of Havenwood had just, in the space of a single kiss, saved her reputation and utterly destroyed her composure, both at once. The carriage ride home was silent except for the sound of wheels on cobblestone and the occasional soft creak of the springs beneath them. Elinor sat pressed into the corner of the seat, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at nothing in particular while her mother watched her with an expression caught somewhere between worry and disbelief. "Elinor," her mother finally said, breaking the silence, "you must tell me what that was. The entire room saw it. By morning all of London will have heard." "I do not know what it was," Elinor said, her voice unsteady. "I did not ask for it. I did not expect it." "The Duke of Havenwood kissed you in front of 200 guests," her mother said, still sounding as though she could hardly believe her own words. "A man does not do such a thing lightly. Whatever his reasons, you are now tied to him in the eyes of everyone who witnessed it." Elinor pressed her fingers against her temple, trying to slow the whirl of thoughts crowding her mind. She understood, even through her shock, exactly what her mother meant. A public gesture like that could not simply be brushed aside as an eccentric impulse. Society would expect it to mean something. It would expect a courtship to follow, and soon, an announcement, and eventually a wedding. Anything less would create an entirely new scandal, one perhaps even more damaging than the first. "He said he did it to stop the rumor," Elinor murmured. "He said he could not stand by and watch it happen." "That may be true," her mother said gently, "but intentions rarely matter once an action has been witnessed by half the ton. The story tomorrow will not be about why he did it. It will simply be about what he did." Elinor closed her eyes and let her head rest against the cool glass of the carriage window. Only hours ago she had walked into that ballroom expecting nothing more than an evening of dancing and light conversation. Now her entire future felt suddenly, dizzyingly uncertain, reshaped by a single unexpected moment she had never asked for and could not undo. She thought of the warmth of his hand briefly resting near her arm as he stepped back, the steadiness in his voice as he spoke to the room, the quiet certainty in his eyes just before he had closed the distance between them. It had not felt cruel or careless. It had felt strangely deliberate, protective, and that confused her more than anything else about the whole evening. By the time the carriage pulled up in front of their townhouse, Alina had resolved to speak with him directly, as soon as possible, and demand an explanation she could actually understand, rather than simply accept whatever conclusions society chose to draw on her behalf. She did not have to wait long. The following afternoon, while Alina sat in the drawing room attempting, without much success, to focus on a book she had read a dozen times before, a servant announced that the Duke of Havenwood had arrived and was requesting a private word. Alina's mother, seated nearby with her needlework, exchanged a quick glance with her daughter before nodding toward the door. "Go on, dear. I will remain within call, but I think it best you speak with him yourself." Alina smoothed the front of her dress, took a steadying breath, and walked into the small sitting room where Sebastian waited, standing near the window with his hands clasped behind his back, looking every bit as composed as he had the previous evening, though there was a tightness around his eyes that suggested he, too, had spent a sleepless night turning over the consequences of his actions. "Your Grace," Alina said, closing the door partway behind her, leaving it open enough to satisfy propriety. "I confess I did not expect a visit so soon." "I thought it best not to delay," Sebastian said. "You deserve an explanation, and I owe you one, without the eyes of the entire ballroom watching us." "Yes," Alina said, crossing her arms lightly. "I believe you do." Sebastian gestured toward the chairs near the fireplace, and once they were both seated, he seemed to gather himself before speaking. "I will not pretend the kiss was a simple, thoughtless impulse. It was calculated. I understood, standing there watching what was happening to you, that a mere denial from me would not be enough to stop the rumor. People believe what excites them, not necessarily what is true. I needed to give them a new story, one so undeniable that the old one would lose its power." "So you used me," Alina said quietly, though there was less anger in her voice than she had expected to feel. "As a tool to correct a wrong, without asking whether I wanted to be used in such a way." Sebastian's expression flickered with something like genuine regret. "You are right to be angry. I should have asked you first. I acted quickly because I feared that if I hesitated, the moment would pass and the rumor would take permanent hold. But that does not excuse the fact that I made a decision affecting your reputation without your consent. For that, I am truly sorry." Alina studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of the calculation her mother had warned her to expect, any hint that this apology, too, was simply another careful performance designed to manage the situation to his advantage. But she found nothing of the sort. Only quiet, sincere discomfort, the discomfort of a man unused to admitting fault, doing so anyway because he believed it necessary. "What happens now?" she asked. "The entire ton believes we are courting. My mother tells me anything less than an actual courtship will only create a fresh scandal." "I believe she is correct," Sebastian said. "I propose we allow the appearance of a courtship to continue for a time. Nothing more than what is necessary to protect your reputation. We need not pretend affections we do not feel. We need only be seen together occasionally, enough to satisfy society's expectations, until the rumor has fully faded and can no longer touch you." Alina considered this carefully. It was, she had to admit, a reasonable solution, even if it left her feeling strangely unsettled, caught between gratitude for his intervention and discomfort at the thought of maintaining a pretense in front of everyone she knew. "And if people ask when we intend to announce a formal engagement," she asked, "what then?" "We will say the timing is not yet right," Sebastian said. "That is common enough. No one will think it strange for a courtship to last several months before any announcement is made." "And Lady Cordelia?" Alina asked, watching his face carefully. "She started this. She deserves consequences, not simply the failure of her plan." Something hardened in Sebastian's expression. "I agree. I do not yet know how best to expose her, but I intend to find a way." A person who deliberately destroys another's reputation for sport should not be allowed to walk away without consequence. Alina felt a small, cautious warmth kindle in her chest at his words, a feeling she quickly tried to suppress, reminding herself that whatever alliance they were forming was born of necessity, not affection. And yet she could not entirely dismiss the steadiness in his voice, the genuine anger on her behalf that seemed to run deeper than simple duty. "Very well," she said finally. "We shall proceed as you suggest, a courtship in appearance only until the danger has passed." Sebastian inclined his head. "Thank you for your understanding, Miss Wren. I know this is not the situation you would have chosen for yourself." "No," Elena admitted, a faint, wry smile touching her lips despite everything. "I imagined my first kiss might come under rather different circumstances." Sebastian's eyes widened slightly, and for just a moment, something almost like embarrassment crossed his composed features. "I did not consider that. I am sorry, truly, if I took something from you that should have been yours to give freely." Elena felt her cheeks warm, surprised by her own honesty and equally surprised by the depth of his response. "It is done now," she said quietly. "We cannot undo it. We can only decide what happens next." They spoke a while longer, working out the practical details of how their false courtship might unfold, which events they would attend together, how often he might call upon her, what small gestures would be necessary to maintain the illusion without drawing further scrutiny. It was, in its own strange way, easier than Elena had expected, falling into a natural rhythm of conversation with a man she had known distantly for years, but never truly spoken with at such length. By the time Sebastian rose to take his leave, the tension between them had eased considerably, replaced by something more like cautious partnership. At the door, he paused and turned back toward her. "Miss Wren," he said, "whatever else comes of this, I want you to know that my regard for your character remains unchanged. I did not act last night to protect a stranger. I acted to protect someone I have always believed to be honest and kind, and far too good to be treated the way that room treated you." Elena's breath caught slightly at the sincerity in his voice. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said softly. "That means a great deal, especially now." After he had gone, Elena stood alone in the small sitting room for several long minutes, staring at the closed door, trying to untangle the confusing mixture of emotions swirling inside her. Relief that her reputation had, for now, been salvaged. Uncertainty about the strange arrangement she had just agreed to. And underneath it all, a small, stubborn flicker of something warmer than either of those feelings, something she was not yet ready to examine too closely. Whatever happened next, she understood one thing with complete clarity. Her life had changed course entirely in the span of a single evening, and there would be no returning to the quiet, predictable existence she had known before. Across town, in the grand study of Havenwood House, Sebastian sat at his desk long into the evening, staring at a blank sheet of paper he had intended to use for a state correspondence, but had not yet touched. His thoughts kept drifting back to the sitting room, to the quiet honesty in Elena's voice, to the way she had accepted his explanation with far more grace than he had any right to expect. He told himself, as he finally forced his attention back to his correspondence, that his actions had been purely a matter of honor, a simple obligation to correct an injustice he could not ignore. But some quieter, more honest part of him suspected the truth was more complicated than that, and that the feelings stirring inside him now had very little to do with duty at all. News of the kiss spread through London faster than the original rumor ever had. Within 2 days, it seemed there was not a single household in the city that had not heard some version of the story, each retelling slightly different, some claiming the Duke had fallen to one knee, others insisting Elena had wept with joy, though in truth she had done nothing but stand there, frozen with shock, while the room watched. Invitations began arriving at the Wren household in numbers Elena had never seen before. Families who had turned their backs on her only days earlier now sent warm notes requesting the pleasure of her company at dinners and afternoon teas. It was, Elena thought bitterly, a strange kind of justice, watching the same tongues that had so eagerly condemned her now scramble to align themselves with her new, elevated standing. "It is remarkable," her mother said one morning, sorting through the growing stack of invitations with something between amusement and disbelief. "Lady Fenwick did not so much as glance at us at the opera last month. Now she is inviting us to her garden party, as though we are the dearest of friends. People believe what benefits them to believe, Eleanor said, not looking up from her needlework. A few days ago it benefited them to believe I was ruined. Now it benefits them to believe I am about to become a duchess. Her mother studied her for a long moment. You sound tired, my dear. I am tired, Eleanor admitted. Tired of being a story other people tell, rather than simply being allowed to exist as myself. Despite her weariness, Eleanor understood the importance of maintaining the appearance Sebastian had created. Over the following 2 weeks, they were seen together several times, exactly as they had planned. He called upon her twice, sitting with her in the drawing room under her mother's watchful but approving eye, their conversation stiff and careful at first, gradually loosening into something more natural as the days passed. They attended a small dinner party hosted by Lord Grayson, where Sebastian remained attentively at her side throughout the evening, offering just enough warmth to satisfy any onlookers without crossing into anything that felt false or performed. Eleanor found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she began to look forward to these encounters. Sebastian was not the distant, reserved figure she had always assumed him to be. In private conversation, he revealed a dry sense of humor she had never glimpsed before, and a genuine curiosity about her opinions on matters most gentlemen of her acquaintance never bothered to ask about at all. He asked about the books she read, the causes she cared for, her thoughts on the management of her family's small estate. He listened, really listened in a way that made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, truly seen. You are not at all what I expected, she admitted to him one afternoon, as they walked together through Hyde Park, her maid trailing a respectful distance behind them to preserve appearances. What did you expect? Sebastian asked, amused. A man far too serious to laugh at anything, Eleanor said. Someone who spends his evenings reading legal documents purely for enjoyment. Sebastian laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised them both. I confess I do enjoy legal documents rather more than most people would consider healthy, but I promise I am capable of laughter as well, on occasion. On rare occasion, Eleanor teased. Increasingly less rare, Sebastian said, glancing at her, in recent company. Eleanor felt warmth creep into her cheeks and quickly looked away, focusing on the path ahead, though she could not entirely suppress the small, pleased smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. It was during these quiet, ordinary moments, far removed from the drama of the ballroom, that Eleanor began to notice something shifting inside her, something she had not expected and was not entirely certain she was ready to name. The lines between pretense and reality had begun to blur in ways that unsettled her far more than the original rumor ever had. Not everyone, however, was pleased to see the arrangement flourishing. Lady Cordelia Vane, having watched her carefully constructed scheme collapse so publicly, had spent the following weeks nursing her wounded pride in private, her smile growing tighter each time she was forced to witness Eleanor's newly restored standing. She had expected humiliation and ruin for Eleanor. Instead, she had inadvertently handed her rival the most eligible bachelor in London. It is unbearable, Cordelia hissed to her closest companion, Miss Lucy Fairweather, during a quiet corner conversation at yet another gathering where Eleanor and Sebastian were once again the center of admiring attention. She was supposed to be ruined. Instead, she is practically a duchess already. Perhaps it is time to abandon the matter, Lucy suggested cautiously. The plan did not work as you intended. Continuing to pursue it now only risks exposing your own involvement. I will not simply abandon it, Cordelia snapped, her eyes fixed across the room on Eleanor's smiling face. There must be another way. Something that cannot be undone by a single dramatic gesture. Lucy hesitated before speaking again. What did you have in mind? Cordelia's expression sharpened into something calculating. The Duke's reputation is spotless, impossible to attack directly, but every family has secrets, Lucy. Every family has something they would prefer remain hidden. Perhaps it is time I discovered what the Wren family might be hiding. Unaware of the quiet scheming unfolding against her, Alina continued to navigate her strange new life, balancing the careful performance of courtship with the increasingly confusing reality of her genuine feelings. She confided little of this confusion to her mother, uncertain how to explain something she barely understood herself, but she did speak of it once, hesitantly, to Charlotte during a private afternoon visit. "I do not know what is real anymore," Alina admitted, staring into her teacup as though it might offer some answer. "We agreed this would be pretense, nothing more, until the scandal faded, but when I am with him it does not feel like pretense at all." Charlotte studied her friend with a knowing smile. "Perhaps because it is not entirely pretense, not anymore if it ever truly was." "That is precisely what frightens me," Alina said. "If I allow myself to believe this is real, and it is not, I do not know how I would survive the disappointment." "And if it is real," Charlotte said gently, "and you refuse to allow yourself to believe it out of fear, you may lose something far more precious than you realize." Alina had no answer for that, only a quiet, uncertain ache in her chest that lingered long after Charlotte had gone home for the evening. Meanwhile, Sebastian faced his own quiet reckoning. He had begun the arrangement with clear, practical intentions, certain he could maintain a comfortable distance even while playing the role of an attentive suitor. But comfortable distance had proven far more difficult to maintain than he anticipated. Each visit left him thinking of Alina long after he had returned home. Each conversation revealed new depths to her character that only deepened his admiration. He found himself, against every careful plan he had made, genuinely looking forward to their next meeting rather than simply enduring it as an obligation. He mentioned none of this to anyone, not even to his closest friend and longtime companion. Lord William Harcourt, though William, sharp-eyed as ever, noticed the change regardless. "You have not stopped smiling since you arrived," William observed one evening, as the two men sat together over a quiet drink at Havenwood House. "It is beginning to concern me." "I am simply in good spirits," Sebastian said, though the smile he was fighting to suppress suggested otherwise. "Good spirits caused by a certain Miss Wren, perhaps?" William asked, raising an eyebrow. Sebastian did not answer immediately, staring instead into his glass, turning the truth over carefully before finally admitting it aloud, if only to himself. "I did not expect this, William. I began this arrangement believing I could separate duty from feeling. I find I was mistaken." William's expression softened. "Then perhaps it is time you stopped pretending this is only an arrangement and started considering what you truly want." Sebastian said nothing, but the words settled deep, refusing to be dismissed, planting a seed of clarity that would only grow stronger in the weeks ahead, even as danger, quiet and unseen, continued gathering around them both. Lady Cordelia Vane did not give up easily. In the weeks that followed her failed attempt to ruin Alina through simple gossip, she turned her attention toward something far more dangerous, something with the power to inflict lasting damage rather than a single evening of embarrassment. She began, quietly and carefully, to investigate the private affairs of the Wren family, searching for any weakness she might exploit. It did not take long for her to find one. Alina's brother, Henry Wren, had spent the previous year managing the family's small country estate, while their father recovered from a lingering illness that had left him too weak to handle the responsibility himself. Henry was young, well-meaning but inexperienced, and in his eagerness to prove himself capable, he had made a series of poor financial decisions, borrowing against future harvests to cover unexpected repairs, entering agreements with merchants who charged unfair rates to a young man they recognized as inexperienced and desperate. The debts were not enormous, not by the standards of London's wealthiest families, but they were significant enough to cause real difficulty if called in suddenly, and embarrassing enough to cause real damage to the family's reputation if made public. Careless management of an estate, especially by the family of a young woman recently linked to the Duke of Havenwood, would provide exactly the kind of ammunition Cordelia needed. She learned of the debts through a servant she had quietly bribed, a young man employed at one of the merchant houses Henry had borrowed from, eager enough for extra coin that he did not think too carefully about where the information he shared might eventually lead. Armed with this knowledge, Cordelia began, subtly at first, to plant seeds of doubt. A comment here, a raised eyebrow there, always phrased carefully enough to avoid direct accusation while still ensuring the right people began to wonder. I do hope the Wren family's finances are in better order than I have heard suggested, she remarked casually to a group of matrons during an afternoon tea, her tone light and concerned, as though she were merely sharing a worry rather than planting a seed. It would be such a shame if the Duke found himself entangled with a family carrying significant debt. The comment spread, as she knew it would, gathering weight and detail with each retelling until it reached Alina's ears in a form far more damaging than the simple truth. By the time it circled back to her, the rumor claimed the Wren family was on the verge of complete financial ruin, their estate mortgaged beyond recovery, their debts so severe that Henry had considered fleeing the country to escape his creditors. Alina heard the whispered version from Charlotte, who arrived at the Wren townhouse looking pale and worried, clutching her friend's hands the moment she was shown into the drawing room. "You must tell me the truth of it," Charlotte said. "I have heard the most alarming things today, about debts, about Henry, about the estate." Alina felt the familiar cold dread of the earlier scandal returning, though this time it came laced with genuine fear rather than simple humiliation. Because this time, unlike the fabricated garden encounter, there was a kernel of truth buried somewhere inside the exaggeration. "Henry has made some difficult decisions this past year," Alina admitted carefully, "but nothing so severe as what you describe. Our estate is not mortgaged beyond recovery. We are not facing ruin. There have been debts, yes, incurred through inexperience rather than recklessness, but nothing that cannot eventually be managed." "Then someone has taken a small truth and twisted it into something far worse," Charlotte said grimly. "Cordelia again, I would wager." Alina's stomach tightened at the thought. If Cordelia had somehow uncovered Henry's genuine financial difficulties, however minor they truly were, and had chosen to exaggerate and spread them for the sole purpose of damaging the family's standing, it meant her earlier scheme had not been a single isolated act of jealousy, but rather part of a broader, more persistent campaign of cruelty. Alina immediately sent word to Sebastian, requesting he call upon her at his earliest convenience. He arrived within the hour, his expression grave as she recounted everything Charlotte had told her. "This changes things considerably," Sebastian said, pacing slowly across the drawing room as he considered the problem. "A rumor about a private encounter, however damaging, can be countered through a single decisive gesture, as we have already seen. But a rumor about financial ruin cannot be so easily dismissed. It requires proof, real proof, to counter it effectively." "My father's accounts are not in the state Cordelia is suggesting," Alina said. "Henry made mistakes, yes, but they are manageable. If people could simply see the true state of our finances, the rumor would collapse under its own exaggeration. Then we must find a way to demonstrate that truth clearly, without appearing defensive or desperate," Sebastian said. "And more importantly, we must find proof that Lady Cordelia is the source of this new rumor, just as she was the source of the first. If we can expose her pattern of deliberate cruelty, we will not only clear your family's name, we will ensure she can never attempt something like this again." "How do we find such proof?" Alina asked. "She is careful. She has not made a single public accusation herself, only planted seeds through others." Sebastian's expression turned thoughtful. "Every scheme leaves a trail if one knows where to look. The servant who first spread word of Henry's debts, wherever he learned it, must have some connection back to her. Servants talk to other servants far more freely than their employers realize. If we can trace the rumor back through its earliest sources, we may find the connection we need." "And if we cannot," Alina asked, unable to keep a note of fear from her voice, "what happens then?" Sebastian stopped pacing and turned to face her directly, his expression softening. "Then we will manage regardless. I have no intention of allowing this to harm you or your family, whether we succeed in exposing Cordelia or not. My resources are considerable, Eleanor. If your family's debts require settling to remove any grounds for this rumor entirely, I am prepared to assist. Eleanor felt her breath catch at the offer, surprised by both its generosity and its implications. You would do that, for a courtship that began as nothing more than a necessary pretense. Sebastian was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady and unusually vulnerable. I am no longer certain it remains only pretense, Eleanor, not for me at least. The words hung between them, charged and uncertain, neither of them quite ready to examine them too closely amid the pressing danger surrounding them both. Eleanor felt her heart racing, torn between the fear consuming her family's situation and the sudden, dizzying warmth of his admission. We should focus on the immediate problem, she said finally, though her voice was softer than she intended, betraying more feeling than she meant to reveal. Yes, Sebastian agreed, equally soft, we should. Over the following days, Sebastian set discreet inquiries into motion, employing a trusted associate skilled in quietly gathering information without drawing undue attention. Meanwhile, Eleanor worked alongside her father and brother to compile a clear, honest accounting of the family's true financial situation, determined to have proof ready the moment it was needed. Henry, mortified to learn that his youthful mistakes had become the center of such a damaging rumor, threw himself into the effort with genuine remorse. I never meant to bring shame upon the family, he told Eleanor one evening, as they worked together late into the night, sorting through ledgers and correspondence. I only wanted to prove I could manage things well in Father's absence. You were young and inexperienced and left with far too much responsibility too quickly, Eleanor said gently, resting a comforting hand on her brother's shoulder. Mistakes born of inexperience are not the same as recklessness or dishonor. Anyone reasonable would understand the difference if only they knew the truth. Do you think we will find proof of who spread this? Henry asked. I believe we will, Eleanor said, with more confidence than she entirely felt. And when we do, I intend to make certain everyone understands exactly what kind of person Lady Cordelia truly is. As the days passed, tension mounted steadily through London society, the rumor about the Wren family's finances spreading in fits and starts, occasionally countered by Sebastian's carefully placed, quiet reassurances to influential members of the ton who trusted his judgment implicitly. But whispers, once released, proved as difficult to fully contain as they had the first time, and Eleanor found herself once again enduring pointed glances and hushed conversations at every social gathering she attended. Through it all, however, she found herself drawing genuine strength from Sebastian's steady presence beside her, his quiet determination to see the matter resolved, his unwavering insistence that whatever happened, he would not allow harm to come to her or her family if it was within his power to prevent it. Late one evening, as they sat together in the Wren family's drawing room reviewing the latest reports from Sebastian's associate, a servant arrived with an unexpected message, breathless from having hurried across town. The associate had found something. A connection, finally, tracing the rumor's earliest source directly back to a member of Lady Cordelia Vane's own household staff. Eleanor and Sebastian exchanged a long look, equal parts relief and renewed determination, both understanding that the proof they needed might finally, at last, be within reach. The associate Sebastian had employed, a quiet, methodical man named Mr. Pemberton who had once worked in service to a magistrate before turning his skills toward private inquiries, arrived at Havenwood House early the following morning with a leather folder tucked carefully beneath his arm. Sebastian received him immediately, sending word for Eleanor to join them the moment she was able, understanding that whatever information Pemberton had uncovered concerned her family as much as it concerned him. Eleanor arrived within the hour, her mother accompanying her as chaperone, both of them anxious with anticipation as they settled into the study where Sebastian and Pemberton waited. "Tell us what you have found," Sebastian said, once introductions and pleasantries had been dispensed with as quickly as courtesy allowed. Pemberton opened his folder and withdrew several sheets of careful, cramped handwriting, notes he had compiled over the course of his investigation. I traced the rumor concerning Mr. Henry Wren's debts back through 3 separate sources before finding its true origin. It began, as you suspected, within Lady Cordelia Vane's own household. A young footman in her employ has a cousin who works for one of the merchant houses your brother borrowed from, my lady, he said, addressing Alina directly. The footman learned of the debts through this family connection, and by his own admission when questioned, was paid a sum of money by Lady Cordelia herself to share the information. He admitted this, Alina asked, hardly daring to believe the investigation had progressed so quickly and so favorably. He did, once assured that his own role would not result in legal consequence, provided he told the full truth, Pemberton said. I have his signed statement here, along with the statement of a second servant who witnessed Lady Cordelia instructing the footman on precisely how the information should be shared, and with whom, to ensure its spread as widely and as damagingly as possible. Sebastian took the papers, scanning them quickly before passing them to Alina. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the careful, formal language of the statements, each word confirming what she had suspected from the very beginning, but had never been able to prove. This is more than enough, Sebastian said, his voice hard with quiet anger. This proves not only that she spread false information, but that she deliberately sought out private financial matters with the specific intention of causing harm. This is not simple gossip, Alina. This is a calculated campaign against your family. What do we do with this? Alina's mother asked, looking between the two of them. Confronting her directly seems dangerous. She may simply deny everything, claim the servants are lying. We will not confront her directly, Sebastian said. Not at first. I intend to bring this evidence before Lord Grayson and several other influential members of society whose opinions carry significant weight, people who have themselves been troubled by the pattern of cruel rumors surrounding Miss Wren these past weeks. Once they understand the truth, Lady Cordelia's reputation will suffer far more than any denial or excuse could repair. And Henry's debts? Alina asked. Even once Cordelia is exposed, the underlying truth remains. He did borrow unwisely. Then we address that separately and honestly, Sebastian said. I have already spoken with my own solicitor about assisting your family in restructuring the debts on more favorable terms. There is no shame in a young man making mistakes while managing responsibility thrust upon him too early. What matters is that the truth, the full and honest truth, be allowed to stand on its own, rather than the exaggerated version Cordelia constructed to cause maximum harm. Alina felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the relief of finally having proof after weeks of anxious uncertainty, and equally overwhelmed by the depth of Sebastian's continued commitment to protecting her family, a commitment that had grown far beyond anything required by their original arrangement. I do not know how to thank you for this, she said softly. You need not thank me, Sebastian said, his gaze holding hers with quiet intensity. I have told you before, Alina, my feelings in this matter stopped being simple duty quite some time ago. Her mother, sensing the private nature of the moment passing between them, rose and gathered her things with practiced discretion. Mr. Pemberton, perhaps you might walk me through the remaining details of your findings in the other room. I find I have several questions regarding the second servant's statement. Pemberton, understanding the unspoken request, nodded and followed her out, leaving Alina and Sebastian alone in the quiet study. You did not have to involve yourself so deeply in my family's troubles, Alina said, once they were alone. This began as a way to protect my reputation from a single evening's damage. It has become something far larger. It became something larger the moment I realized how much I cared what happened to you, Sebastian said, his voice quiet but steady. Alina, I do not wish to continue pretending this is simply an arrangement of convenience. I have grown to care for you deeply these past weeks, far beyond anything I anticipated when I made that impulsive decision at Lord Grayson's ball. Alina's heart pounded as she searched his face, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. I have felt the same, she admitted quietly. I did not want to at first. I told myself it was foolish to develop real feelings for a pretense that might end the moment the scandal faded. But I could not stop myself, no matter how carefully I tried. Sebastian took a step closer, his expression softening into something warmer than she had ever seen from him before. Then let us stop pretending, at least between the two of us, that this is anything other than real. Before Alina could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the study door, and a servant entered with an urgent expression, holding a folded note. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace, Miss Wren," the servant said, "but this arrived just now, marked urgent, from Lord Grayson's household." Sebastian took the note, breaking the seal quickly and scanning its contents. His expression darkened as he read. "What is it?" Alina asked, her earlier warmth giving way to renewed concern. "Lady Cordelia has learned we possess evidence against her," Sebastian said grimly. "Lord Grayson writes that she called upon him this morning, apparently attempting to discredit any accusations before they could be formally presented, claiming instead that we have fabricated the entire matter to protect your family's reputation and distract from your brother's genuine financial troubles. She is trying to turn the truth around on us," Alina said, her stomach twisting with fresh anxiety, claiming we invented the scheme rather than her. "She is desperate," Sebastian said. "Desperate people often act rashly, which frequently works in our favor rather than against us. But we must move quickly now, before she has further opportunity to muddy the truth. I intend to request a formal gathering at Lord Grayson's home this very evening, where the full evidence can be presented clearly, before witnesses whose judgment cannot be easily swayed by clever manipulation." Alina felt a fresh wave of nervous energy replace her earlier fear. "Then let us prepare. I will not allow her to twist this any further, not after everything my family has endured because of her cruelty." Sebastian nodded, his earlier tenderness now sharpened into focused determination. "Together, then. We face this together, Alina, exactly as we have faced everything else these past weeks." The remainder of the day passed in careful preparation, Sebastian coordinating with Lord Grayson to arrange the evening gathering, Pemberton organizing his statements and evidence into a clear, undeniable presentation, and Alina working, alongside her father and brother to ensure their own financial records were ready to demonstrate the true, manageable state of their affairs, free from Cordelia's exaggerations. By the time evening arrived, and Alina stepped once more into Lord Grayson's grand townhouse, this time with Sebastian steady and unwavering at her side, she felt none of the fear and humiliation that had consumed her during that first fateful ball. In its place stood something far stronger, quiet, unshakable resolve and the growing certainty that whatever unfolded in the hours ahead, she would not face it alone. Lord Grayson's drawing room, usually reserved for cheerful gatherings of close friends, felt entirely different that evening. A smaller crowd than the original ball, but a far more influential one, filled the room with quiet, expectant tension. Lord Grayson himself stood near the fireplace, his expression grave, while several other prominent members of society, individuals whose opinions carried considerable weight across London, took their seats with curious, watchful eyes. Alina sat beside her mother, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while Sebastian remained standing near the center of the room, Mr. Pemberton at his side with his careful folder of evidence. Lady Cordelia arrived precisely on time, dressed elegantly, her composure carefully maintained despite the tightness Alina could see around her eyes. She took her seat with an air of wounded dignity, as though she were the one being unfairly accused rather than the one who had orchestrated months of calculated cruelty. "I understand," Lord Grayson began, once everyone had settled, "that certain serious accusations have been raised this evening, accusations which deserve careful and fair examination before all of us present. Your Grace, I believe you wish to speak first." Sebastian stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying clearly through the quiet room. Several weeks ago, a cruel and entirely fabricated rumor began circulating about Miss Alina Wren, suggesting she had been discovered in a compromising situation that never occurred. More recently, a second rumor emerged, this time concerning the financial affairs of the Wren family, exaggerated far beyond the truth to suggest ruin and disgrace where none exists. Tonight, I intend to present clear evidence demonstrating that both rumors originated from the same source, deliberately spread with the intention of causing lasting harm. Lady Cordelia's expression remained composed, though Alina noticed the slight tightening of her grip on her fan. "This is a serious accusation, Your Grace, made without any proof I have yet seen." "The proof is precisely what I intend to offer," Sebastian said, nodding to Pemberton, who stepped forward and began reading, in a clear, steady voice, the signed statements he had gathered, first from the footman who had admitted receiving payment to spread word of Henry's debts, then from the second servant who had witnessed Lady Cordelia's direct instructions on how the information should be shared. A murmur passed through the room as Pemberton finished reading, several of the assembled guests exchanging troubled, disbelieving glances toward Lady Cordelia, whose composed mask had begun, ever so slightly, to crack. "These are servants," Cordelia said, her voice sharper now less certain. "Easily bribed to say whatever is asked of them. This proves nothing beyond the desperation of the Wren family to salvage their reputation through fabricated accusations." "I anticipated such a defense," Sebastian said calmly, "which is why I did not rely on these statements alone." He produced a final document from Pemberton's folder, a written receipt bearing Lady Cordelia's own signature, recording a payment made to the footman on the very date the servant had described. This receipt was recovered from the merchant house where the payment was processed, an establishment that keeps careful records of all transactions passing through its accounts, regardless of the parties involved. "I believe, Lady Cordelia, this signature is yours." The room fell utterly silent as Sebastian handed the receipt to Lord Grayson, who examined it carefully before passing it among several of the other assembled guests, each of them studying the signature with growing certainty. Lady Cordelia's face had gone pale, her earlier composure entirely abandoned now. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier conviction. "A payment for an entirely unrelated matter, nothing more." "Perhaps you might explain then," Lord Grayson said, his tone no longer warm, "why the footman's own signed statement describes, in specific detail, being instructed to visit particular households and repeat particular phrases regarding the Wren family's finances, all on the very same day this payment was recorded." Cordelia had no answer, her mouth opening slightly before closing again, the silence stretching uncomfortably as every eye in the room remained fixed upon her. It was then that Alina rose from her seat, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I do not say this out of anger alone, though I confess I have felt a great deal of anger these past weeks. I say this because I believe everyone in this room deserves to understand exactly what happened, and why. Lady Cordelia began spreading the first rumor about me out of jealousy, over a gentleman's attention neither of us ultimately received. When that failed to destroy my reputation, she turned her efforts toward my family, uncovering my brother's private financial difficulties and twisting them into something far worse than they truly were, purely to cause harm. "That is a serious accusation, Miss Wren," one of the older gentlemen present said carefully. "It is," Alina agreed, "and I do not make it lightly. I have spent these past weeks watching a story about myself spread through this city, a story with no truth in it at all, simply because someone decided my reputation was worth less than her own satisfaction. I would ask, now that the truth has finally been laid clearly before you, that you judge for yourselves who among us has behaved honorably and who has not." The silence that followed felt heavier than any that had come before, broken finally by Lord Grayson's measured, formal voice. "I believe the evidence presented tonight speaks clearly for itself. Lady Cordelia, I think it best you consider carefully how you intend to proceed from here, understanding that this evening's events will not remain contained to this room alone." Cordelia rose abruptly, her earlier elegance entirely abandoned, replaced by something brittle and furious. "You will all regret siding with her," she said, though her voice lacked any real conviction now, the words sounding more like a desperate final effort than an actual threat. She turned and left the room without another word, her rapid footsteps echoing down the hall until the front door closed sharply behind her. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, the room began to shift, quiet conversations breaking out among the assembled guests, sympathetic glances now turning toward Alina rather than away from her. Several of the older, more influential women present rising to offer quiet words of comfort and reassurance. Lord Grayson approached Alina and Sebastian directly, his expression softened considerably from its earlier gravity. "Miss Wren, I owe you an apology for ever having entertained such rumors, however briefly. Your Grace, I commend your diligence in uncovering the truth. I believe you may both consider this matter fully and finally resolved." Alina felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Months of anxious tension, finally beginning to loosen their grip on her chest. She turned to find Sebastian watching her with quiet pride, and something warmer besides. "It is over," she said softly, hardly daring to believe it. "Truly over." "It is," Sebastian confirmed, his voice equally soft. "And Alina, I find that I am glad it happened, difficult as it was, because it brought me to you in a way I do not believe would have happened otherwise." Alina felt her heart swell with an emotion she no longer had any desire to suppress or question. "I am glad too," she admitted. "Strange as that may sound, given everything we endured to arrive here." As the gathering slowly dispersed into the evening, guests offering their farewells and renewed expressions of support, Alina and Sebastian remained near the fireplace a while longer, neither quite ready to end the quiet, private moment they had finally, after so many weeks of pretense and danger, earned the right to share honestly. The scandal that had once threatened to destroy Alina's entire future had, in the end, revealed something far more valuable than the reputation it had nearly cost her. A genuine, unguarded connection with a man she had never expected to know so deeply, forged through hardship into something she now trusted completely. In the weeks that followed the gathering at Lord Grayson's home, London society moved on from the scandal with the same speed it had once used to spread it, though this time the story that lingered was one of admiration rather than cruelty. Lady Cordelia Vane, her reputation irreparably damaged by the evening's revelations, withdrew from society entirely, retreating to her family's country estate to wait out the inevitable talk that continued to circulate about her for months afterward. Few mourned her absence from the usual gatherings, and fewer still defended her once the full truth had settled into common knowledge. For Alina, life slowly returned to something resembling normalcy, though it was a different normalcy than the one she had known before, colored now by a quiet confidence she had not possessed in the anxious weeks following the original rumor. She attended balls and dinners once more without the weight of dread pressing against her chest, greeted warmly by families who had once whispered cruelly behind their fans, though she found herself, more often than not, far more interested in a single quiet conversation with Sebastian than in any of the wider social performance surrounding them. Their courtship, no longer a matter of careful pretense, deepened steadily over the following months. Sebastian called upon her regularly, no longer out of obligation to maintain appearances, but out of genuine desire for her company. Their conversations ranged freely now, unguarded by the careful calculations that had once shaped every word between them. He told her, one quiet evening, about the loneliness of his childhood, raised with the heavy expectations of a dukedom pressed upon him from an early age, taught to value duty and restraint above all else. She told him about her own quiet fears, the constant awareness every young woman of her position carried, of how fragile a reputation truly was, how easily built and how easily destroyed. "I used to believe," Sebastian admitted to her one afternoon, as they walked together through the gardens at Havenwood House, no chaperone trailing quite so closely as propriety once demanded, given the understanding now firmly established between their families, that duty and feeling existed as entirely separate matters, that a man in my position acted according to obligation, and kept his heart carefully guarded from anything that might complicate his responsibilities. "And now," Alina asked, watching him with quiet curiosity. Now I understand that the two are not so easily separated after all, Sebastian said. What began as duty, that first night at the ball, became something far deeper than I ever anticipated. I do not believe I could have separated my feelings from my actions, even if I had tried harder to do so. Alina smiled softly, reaching to touch his hand where it rested on the garden path's low stone wall. I am glad you did not try harder then. They continued walking in comfortable silence for a while, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden shadows across the neatly trimmed hedges, before Sebastian spoke again, his tone shifting into something more serious. Alina, I have given a great deal of thought to what comes next for us. I do not wish to continue simply courting, allowing society to wonder indefinitely when an announcement might finally come. I find I no longer wish to wait. Alina's heart began to race, though she kept her expression carefully composed, sensing the weight building behind his words. What are you saying, Sebastian? He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his usual careful composure giving way to something far more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen from him. I am saying that I love you, Alina Wren, not out of duty, not out of obligation to correct a wrong I witnessed months ago, but simply because you are the most honest, courageous, and remarkable woman I have ever known. I want to marry you, truly and completely, not as a solution to a scandal, but because I cannot imagine my life continuing without you at the center of it. Tears gathered in Alina's eyes, though these tears carried none of the anxious weight of the ones she had shed during those difficult weeks of scandal and uncertainty. These were tears of pure, overwhelming joy. Sebastian, she said softly, I love you too. I have for some time now, though I was too frightened to fully admit it, even to myself, uncertain whether what we shared could ever be as real as it felt. It is entirely real, Sebastian said, his voice thick with emotion. As real as anything I have ever known. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, opening it carefully to reveal a delicate ring, its simple elegance perfectly suited to Alina's own quiet, understated grace. Alina Wren, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Alina felt her breath catch, joy and disbelief and overwhelming love all tangled together in her chest as she looked from the ring to Sebastian's hopeful, earnest face. Yes, she said, laughing through her happy tears. Yes, Sebastian, of course, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger with careful, reverent hands before drawing her into an embrace, and this time when their lips met, there was no ballroom full of watching strangers, no calculated purpose behind the gesture, nothing but two people who had found, through the most unlikely of circumstances, a love neither had ever expected to know so completely. News of their engagement spread through London with the same rapid speed that had once carried the cruel rumors of Alina's supposed ruin, though this time every word carried genuine warmth and admiration rather than malice. Invitations and congratulations poured in from every corner of society, and even those who had once whispered so eagerly behind their fans now spoke openly of what a fitting match the Duke of Havenwood had found in Miss Alina Wren. Alina's mother wept with happiness upon hearing the news, embracing her daughter tightly. I always believed something good would come of that terrible evening, she said, though Alina suspected her mother's memory of her own reaction that night had softened considerably with the passage of time and the arrival of such joyful news. Henry, relieved beyond measure to see his family's difficulties fully resolved, and his sister so genuinely happy, threw himself into preparations for the wedding with an enthusiasm that made Alina laugh more than once at his eager attempts to assist with details far beyond his usual interests. The wedding itself, held on a bright, clear morning in early autumn, was a grand affair, attended by nearly all of London society, including many of the very families who had once turned their backs on Alina during those difficult weeks months earlier. Alina did not hold their earlier behavior against them, understanding, with the wisdom that hardship had taught her, that fear and self-interest often shaped people's choices more than genuine malice, and that forgiveness, freely given, weighed far lighter on the heart than resentment carried indefinitely. She stood at the front of the church in a gown of pale ivory silk, her hands steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest, watching Sebastian wait for her at the altar with an expression of such open, unguarded love that any remaining doubt she might have carried dissolved entirely the moment their eyes met. As she walked down the aisle toward him, Elena found herself thinking, briefly, of that terrible night so many months ago, standing frozen in a ballroom full of cruel whispers, certain her entire future had been destroyed by a lie she never told. She thought of the courage it had taken to hold her head high despite the humiliation, and of the unexpected kindness that had followed, a single bold gesture that had, against every reasonable expectation, transformed the worst night of her life into the beginning of the greatest happiness she had ever known. When she reached the altar, Sebastian took her hands in his eyes bright with emotion as the ceremony began, and Elena felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and completely at peace. "I, Sebastian, take thee, Elena," he said, his voice steady and clear, carrying easily through the quiet, attentive church. "To have and to hold from this day forward through whatever challenges life may bring, knowing now with absolute certainty that there is no one else I would ever wish to face them beside." Elena repeated her own vows through happy tears, her voice trembling only slightly with the depth of emotion she carried, and when the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, and Sebastian leaned forward to kiss her, gently and completely, in front of the same society that had once so eagerly condemned her, Elena felt the last remaining shadow of that painful night finally, fully lift away. The kiss that had once been given to silence a cruel and baseless rumor had, over the course of many difficult, uncertain months, grown into something entirely different, something true and lasting and freely chosen by two people who had found, through unlikely circumstance, a love neither had expected, but both had come to treasure completely. As they walked back down the aisle together as husband and wife, greeted by the joyful applause and warm smiles of family and friends, Elena glanced up at Sebastian and found him already looking down at her, his expression full of quiet wonder, as though he still could not quite believe his own good fortune. "Any regrets, Your Grace?" she teased softly, echoing words she had once spoken to him in anger, though now they carried nothing but love. "Only one," Sebastian said, his eyes warm with affection, "that I did not find the courage to fall in love with you far sooner than I did." Elena laughed, resting her head briefly against his shoulder as they continued down the aisle together, toward the bright autumn sunlight waiting beyond the church doors, and toward a future neither of them could have imagined on that fateful night, when a single, unexpected kiss had changed the entire course of both their lives. A year passed swiftly after the wedding, filled with the quiet, contented rhythms of married life at Havenwood House. Elena settled into her new role as Duchess with the same honest, unpretentious grace that had always defined her, quickly winning the genuine respect of the household staff and tenants who had initially wondered what sort of mistress the reserved Duke had finally chosen to bring into their lives. She proved warm and attentive, taking a genuine interest in the well-being of everyone under Havenwood's care, remembering names and small details others in her position might have overlooked entirely. Sebastian, for his part, found himself a changed man in the most welcome of ways. The quiet reserve that had once defined him in public settings softened considerably in Elena's steady presence, his rare laughter becoming a far more common sound throughout the halls of their home. Friends who had known him for years remarked often on the difference, teasing him gently about the transformation while privately admitting they had never seen him so genuinely content. Henry, having learned valuable lessons from his earlier financial difficulties, applied himself with renewed diligence to managing the family estate, eventually restoring it to a position of comfortable stability under the patient guidance Sebastian had offered, treating the younger man with the same generous patience he had always shown toward Elena herself. Their family's earlier troubles became, over time, little more than a distant memory, rarely spoken of except as a reminder of how far they had all come. Lady Cordelia Vane never fully returned to the London society she had once dominated with such careless cruelty. Word occasionally reached Elinor of her continued isolation in the countryside, and though Elinor felt no particular satisfaction in her rival's diminished circumstances, she could not entirely deny a quiet sense that justice, in its own slow and steady way, had ultimately found its proper balance. Elinor and Sebastian welcomed their first child the following spring, a daughter with her mother's warm, steady eyes and her father's thoughtful, quiet temperament, and the household filled with a new kind of joy neither of them had fully anticipated. Watching Sebastian hold their daughter for the first time, his usual composure entirely melted away into open, unguarded tenderness. Elinor felt certain, more than ever before, that every difficult moment of that long, uncertain scandal had led them, step by careful step, exactly where they were always meant to be. Charlotte, ever the loyal friend, visited often, delighting in watching Elinor's happiness unfold so completely, and frequently reminding her, with a knowing smile, of the advice she had once offered during those uncertain early weeks of pretense and confusion. "I told you it was not entirely pretense," Charlotte said one afternoon, as the two friends sat together in the gardens, watching Elinor's daughter nap peacefully nearby. "Even then I could see it, long before either of you were ready to admit it yourselves." "You were right," Elinor admitted, laughing softly. "Though I confess I am glad I did not fully believe you at the time, or I fear I would have spent those weeks far too flustered to think clearly about anything else at all." As the years continued to unfold, Elinor often found herself reflecting on the strange, unpredictable path that had led her to such deep and lasting happiness. She had once believed that a single evening's cruelty might define the entire course of her life, that a rumor born of jealousy and spite would forever shape how the world perceived her. Instead, that terrible night had become, quite unexpectedly, the very beginning of everything good that followed. She kept, tucked carefully in a small drawer of her writing desk, the very fan she had carried on that fateful evening, a small, sentimental reminder of how far she had traveled since that moment of frozen shock and humiliation. She rarely spoke of it, even to Sebastian, but on quiet evenings, when she found herself alone with her thoughts, she sometimes took it out and studied it, remembering the frightened young woman she had once been, and marveling at the quiet strength and lasting love she had ultimately found on the other side of that darkness. Sebastian, too, carried his own quiet reminders of that transformative night, though his took a different form entirely. He often told their children, as they grew older, the story of how he had met their mother properly for the first time, softening the more difficult details but always emphasizing the same central truth: that courage, honesty, and a willingness to stand up against cruelty, even when it carried real risk, could ultimately lead to the most unexpected and precious of rewards. Their marriage, built first upon necessity and then upon genuine, deeply rooted love, only continued to strengthen with each passing year, weathering the ordinary challenges of family life with the same steady partnership that had first carried them through scandal and uncertainty. Elinor never forgot the lesson that difficult night had taught her. That reputation, however carefully guarded, remained fragile against the cruelty of others. But that character, true and unwavering, could ultimately outlast even the harshest of storms. And Sebastian never forgot the lesson of that same night from his own perspective, that sometimes the boldest, most unexpected actions, taken not out of careful calculation but out of genuine conviction, could change the entire course of a life in ways no careful planning could ever fully anticipate. Years later, when their daughter, grown into a thoughtful young woman herself, asked her parents how they had first fallen in love, Elinor and Sebastian would exchange a warm, knowing glance before beginning the familiar story, one that always began the same way, with a cruel and baseless rumor, a crowded ballroom full of judgment, and a single unexpected kiss that had, against every reasonable expectation, become the truest beginning either of them had ever known. It was, they both agreed, the noblest thing Sebastian had ever done, though neither of them, standing frozen in that glittering ballroom so many years before, could ever have imagined just how far that single, courageous gesture would carry them, or how completely it would come to define the rest of their lives together.